Hello everyone, and welcome to the 223rd episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring our patron and member pick for April 2025, Mike Ehrmantraut from Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, and El Camino. While the patrons and members have fingered Mike for an episode, and considering it's been over a year since I last covered a character from this universe, I'd say that's a pretty welcome sight. Now a few of you may be getting ready to head down to the comments to declare that Mike did nothing wrong, and I wouldn't blame you, because out of all the criminals and evildoers we're exposed to in these series, Mike is definitely one of the more noble ones we're exposed to, a character with a hard exterior and a soft heart that you can't help but love. As it turns out though, Mike is still a criminal, one that's committed his fair share of crimes and unleashed evil into the world. And in this video, we're going to find out just how evil he may have been. We're going to get into the video proper now, but you should definitely check out my new gaming channel by clicking the link in the description, or by clicking the card on your screen if that's something you're interested in. Now without further ado, let's begin. When examining any character, it's always important to delve into their backstory so we can get a better idea of how they developed into the person they are. But Mike's backstory is largely a mystery. We know that prior to him moving out to New Mexico, he lived in Philadelphia and served as a police officer there for a number of years, and we can assume that he was either born and raised there or somewhere else on the East Coast, as it's implied by him stating to Stacy once he arrives in New Mexico that he likes how spacious it is out there, that he spent most of his life on the East Coast. As far as his upbringing goes, we only have one line to go off of, that being Mike's statement to Werner Ziegler that all his father left him was a cold water flat and a stack of bills, implying that Mike's father wasn't exactly the most hardworking or loving father, whom his son likely had a poor relationship with. We don't really know this, but it's implied that Mike served in the United States Marine Corps in his youth as a sniper during the Vietnam War, as when he's buying an M40 rifle from Lawson, the rifle that Marine snipers have used since 1966. He confirms that he's familiar with it when Lawson makes a comment about his knowledge of it, and he then goes on to state that he's glad they changed the stock from wood to fiberglass, because wood warped like hell out in that jungle they were in. Finally, we know Mike had a wife he was married to for 22 years, and that he had a son named Matty. Now, as minimal as the details surrounding Mike's early life are, most of them actually provide us with great insight into his personality and motivations. One of the more prominent aspects of Mike's character is the fact that he's fiercely dedicated to his family and their well-being, as everything Mike did in these series, and everything he probably did before it, he did for his family. Now, that one line about his father only leaving him a cold water flat and a stack of bills might not seem too important, but considering who Mike is, this one little detail could partially explain why he's so dedicated to his family. Caring deeply for one's family isn't exactly unusual, so this component of his character might not be any deeper than him being an inherently nice person who wants what's best for his family. But because this detail is part of his character, we do have to consider that it could be his own father's lack of dedication to his family that caused Mike to prioritize his own over anything else, which would make sense. Not just because witnessing a shoddy caregiver would spur one to be a better one themselves, but because Mike isn't a person who witnesses or experiences injustices and then descends into a state of rage or blames the world for his problems. He's a man who tries to better himself so he doesn't fall into the same traps as other people, and so he doesn't become a person who treats others in a dishonorable or impassionate way. Because Mike is like this, it would make sense that his less than desirable upbringing caused him to adopt this attitude. But it wasn't just the probable negligence of his father that made him this way, as serving in the Vietnam War also likely factored heavily into who Mike became as a person, as war tends to do for anyone. Mike repeatedly shows himself to hold human life in high regard throughout this story, and not just the lives of those closest to him, but the lives of his enemies as well, most of them at least. And being a man who witnessed and dealt out death for perhaps years during wartime, he came to understand that he, nor anyone else, should have to suffer through all the hardship life throws at us in the first place, or should have to suffer through those hardships in the future. And so he became a person who tries to mitigate the suffering of those around him in any way that he can, even if it causes him to suffer harm to his person. That isn't to say that Mike is immune from acting irrationally, hurting those who deserve to be hurt, or making decisions that end up hurting people who don't. But on the whole, when Mike is met with adversity, he assesses the situation, learns from his mistakes or the mistakes of others, and he then makes an effort to fix things, or be better, as he keeps in mind the impact his actions might have on others. Now, this is definitely one of the most standout aspects of Mike's character, but the other noteworthy components of his personality were also likely molded by these experiences, namely his matter-of-fact way of speaking and no-nonsense approach to all aspects of life. But even though he has a famously gruff exterior that would make the hardest of hardasses jealous, beneath it all, Mike has a heart of gold, and he consistently proves that to be true throughout this series. His experiences have also gifted him quite the skill set as well, as Mike is not just skilled in a combative setting, even against people who are much younger and stronger than he is, a man who is so familiar with tense and dangerous situations that even when thugs have broken into his home and might end up murdering him, his hands are steady and his demeanor calm. But he also shows himself to be incredibly knowledgeable in many different fields, ranging from construction to electronics. Mike is also a man who uses every advantage at his disposal, like when he acts the old man in the Tuco situation, or when he does the same thing looking for Werner at the travel agency, showing that he isn't so prideful to the point that he won't allow himself to use his age to his advantage when appropriate. But Mike's greatest talent is his ability to read people, a man who is intimately familiar with the brightest and darkest sides of humanity, who can smell bullshit 30 miles away, a skill that he no doubt developed not just through his service in the military, but through his many years as a police officer. When watching Mike in action, I'm reminded of a line from the HBO series Chernobyl that one of the central characters, Boris Sherbina, says to another by the name of Valery Legasov in regard to a group of miners who have come to aid them in their endeavors. Boris urges Valery to be truthful with the miners, as they work in the dark, so they see everything. Mike embodies that notion perfectly, for he has spent many years working with the darker aspects of humanity, and he has come out the other side a man who has keen eyes and ears that lock onto even the smallest of details, details that then allow him to discern the true nature of a person's character, no matter how well they may be lying. He's so confident when it comes to reading people that he's even capable of confronting a diabolical man like Hector Salamanca and demanding payment from him in the presence of his men, which is one of the more impressive examples of just how well Mike is able to judge a person's character and then accurately predict how a situation is going to play out when he deals with them. Now, so far I've pretty much only discussed the ways in which Mike is a good person, but if Mike were a wholly upstanding citizen who did everything in his power to prevent suffering and uplift others, then we wouldn't be talking about him in this video. For as virtuous as Mike is most of the time, his greatest flaw is derived from his virtuosity. As I mentioned earlier, Mike was a cop for many years, but not just a cop, a dirty cop, like everyone else in his precinct apparently was. We learned this when Mike is speaking to his daughter-in-law Stacy about his son's murder, where he says the following: "You let some things slide. You look the other way. You bust a drug dealer who has more cash than you'll ever earn in a lifetime. Some of it doesn't make it back into evidence. So what? You took a taste. So did everyone else. That's how you knew you were safe. It's like killing Caesar. Everyone's guilty. Maddie wasn't dirty. I was. Everyone was in that precinct. That's how it worked. You turn in your buddy, you're screwing yourself. You go along, you get along." Everybody else was doing it is a pretty good explanation for why a cop, especially one like Mike, would entertain criminality. But there was even more reason for Mike to take this path, which is that flaw that I mentioned a moment ago. The fact that Mike cares so much about his family that he's willing to do whatever it takes to ensure they're cared for. Now that might not seem like a flaw, and normally it isn't. But when that philosophy also includes criminal activity, it's definitely a flaw. Mike's willingness to dirty himself while on the force was his first and greatest sin. For as he says to Saul after they've returned from their stint in the desert, we all make our choices, and those choices, they put us on a road. Sometimes those choices seem small, but they put you on that road. You think about getting off, but eventually, you're back on it. And the road we're on led us out to the desert and everything that happened there and straight back to where we are right now. And nothing can be done about that. That's not necessarily true, as we'll discuss later on, but regardless of whether or not that's a concrete fact of life, more often than not, that's the case for all of us. That once we start down a path, we continue going down that path, even if we'd like to get off of it sometimes. Now, Mike being a dirty cop may not have resulted in anything adverse happening in his life, as it would seem that he almost made it to the end of his career without suffering any of the consequences of his actions. But that's only true on a personal level, for Mike would suffer those consequences not by losing his job, experiencing bodily harm or death, or by being thrown in jail, but through the loss of his son. To what degree Mike is responsible for the death of his son is up for debate, as Mike himself admits that we all make our own choices. However, Mike seems to believe that he is mostly to blame for his son's death, and he might be right about that. Like his father, Maddie wanted to be a police officer, following in the footsteps of a man he idolized like no other. After joining the force though, Maddie quickly realized that many, if not all of his fellow officers were corrupt, and after initially refusing to engage in the criminal activities of his partner Hoffman, he eventually ended up going along at his father's suggestion. And unable to hide his displeasure when he approached Hoffman and another cop named Fensky, they both staged his murder to prevent Maddie from turning them in. Now when Mike is speaking about Maddie's murder with Stacy, he remarks that he's the one who was ultimately responsible for his son's death, because 1. He encouraged Matty to take the money that then led to his death, and 2. Because Matty idolized his father so much that when he found out that Mike was also a dirty cop, it broke him and caused him to go against his better nature and become a dirty cop himself. As I said earlier, it's debatable as to whether or not this is true, for Matty at that point was a man capable of making his own choices. However, Mike's failure to educate his son on the darker aspects of his job prior to him becoming an officer is likely the most damning thing Mike did here, as if he had perhaps prepared his son for the eventuality that he might have to finesse his way around his colleagues' dirty actions in order to make it in their business, then it's possible that none of this would have happened. I say this because Mike describes a heated exchange with his son over the phone about 3 or 4 days before he was murdered, and Stacy describes him as being moody for weeks prior to that, which indicates to me that it was a swell of emotions regarding his partner's involvement in dirty businesses, plus his father's admission that he was as well, that caused Matty to falter when he decided to take the money from Hoffman, something that may not have happened had he been prepared well in advance by his father for such an occasion. No matter to what degree Mike is responsible for his son's death, I think it is reasonable to say that he is at least somewhat responsible. And while we could speculate on what harm Mike caused others by taking dirty money during his career, this is the first verifiable consequence of Mike's willingness to dirty himself, and it was a monumental one at that, one that caused Mike to find his way to the bottom of a bottle to ease his sorrow and guilt, and one that then led him to tracking down and murdering the men responsible for his son's murder. Now, we've talked about revenge a lot on this channel, and most of the time, it proves to be something that either only worsens a character's situation or mental state, to the point that the revenge does nothing to help their situation once it's achieved. In Mike's case, though, the revenge he took was not only cathartic for him, but he got away with it too. While it's probable that Hoffman and Fensky were going to go down at some point, it's always possible that they weren't, and so Mike's choice to kill them could have theoretically been the only punishment they would have ever received for their actions. All that being said, the result Mike got from pursuing his revenge is an anomaly, as the only reason it was so cathartic for him is because he got away with it, as revenge is still typically something that not only doesn't fix your situation in any way, but is something that's liable to cause you more harm than good. And in Mike's case, it almost did, for the 2 detectives who came to New Mexico to interview him about the murders, Abbasi and Sanders, were close to zeroing in on Mike as the perpetrator, and if it weren't for the intervention of Jimmy, in all likelihood, Mike would have spent the rest of his life in prison, wallowing in despair over all the choices he had made in life, and forever separated from the family that he had dedicated most of his life to being with and protecting. Now, earlier I mentioned a speech Mike makes about making choices that set you on a certain road, how after you do so, you're going to keep straying onto that road even if you might want to get off of it sometimes, and how once you've reached a critical point on that road, there's nothing you can do to change what happened. But as I said earlier as well, that's not necessarily true. It is true that once you've done something, or something has happened to you as a result of your actions, you can't do anything to change that. But it isn't true that you're going to keep straying back onto that road as your life plays out, for you can always make the choice to go down a different road. At the point in his life after the detectives had decided to stop pursuing Mike as a suspect, Mike was given the perfect opportunity to take a different path. His son's murderers had been dealt with, and he now lived with his loving daughter-in-law and granddaughter, far away from the troubles that haunted him for most of his life. Mike's greatest combination virtue and flaw was never going to go away though, that being his strong desire to provide for and protect his family. And so when Stacy began to make remarks about living in a less than desirable neighborhood, Mike wanted to make it so they weren't, which led to him taking criminal work that was offered to him by the vet. He started small at first, but back on that road he had so nearly gotten off of, it was only inevitable that his involvement in criminal activity would increase. For it's never enough for a caring parent to provide for their family in the here and now. They must provide for their future as well. And Mike was going to make sure his granddaughter's future would be as bright as it possibly could be, a future that he failed to provide for his son. He does start small though, taking protection jobs here and there for men like Daniel Wormald, but soon enough, he starts working with Nacho Varga after he recruits him to take out Tuco. But although Mike has thus far made it clear that he isn't willing to do jobs that result in the harm of others, this is the moment where he proves just how stalwart this rule of his is, when he does everything he can to not kill Tuco, to the point that he even risks his own life to do so. When the job is done, and Nacho and Mike are talking afterwards, Nacho remarks that Mike went a long way to not pull that trigger, and he asks him why. Mike's response is to just stare at him for a few seconds before getting into his car, and without saying a single word, Mike gives the perfect answer to his question. Mike, unlike the naive Nacho, knows what it's like to kill a man, even if that man is a horrid sociopath, like Tuco was. He not only knows the great risk it brings to yourself as far as the law goes, but he knows that killing a person, no matter who they are, is a horrible thing for anyone to have to experience, something that will not only stick with you for the rest of your days, but will change you forever. At the same time, Mike also shows us here just how much compassion he has for his fellow man when he's dealing with Nacho, especially men who he views as being misguided and in need of help. Like Nacho, a man who no doubt reminded him of his son, which shows in the way Mike treats him like one. Choosing to help Nacho get what he wants without killing Tuco to ensure Nacho doesn't suffer future consequences from doing so shows us just how much Mike values the well-being of others, even those who he's only just met. But as I've said a few times already, this is also one of Mike's greatest flaws, as he keeps to this altruistic approach even when engaged in criminal activity, which only ends up causing him harm in the long run. For in helping Nacho without killing Tuco, instead of the heat bearing down on Nacho, the heat bears down on Mike, with things reaching such a dire point that the Salamancas even threatened to murder his granddaughter. Not only is his family put in harm's way due to his actions, but in his attempts to outmaneuver the Salamancas, Mike ends up causing the death of an innocent person, as after he robs one of the Salamancas' trucks and leaves their driver on the side of the road, that driver is discovered by a good Samaritan passing by, who helps him out of his bindings, which then earns him a nice bullet to the head, courtesy of Hector Salamanca. Now Mike placed a pinky toe onto the slippery slope that is the criminal game, and it's not too long after he set just a bit of himself on that slope that he ends up tumbling down it. From here, Mike gets further involved with cartel business by signing up to work with Gus Fring, and while he keeps to his rule of not harming anyone unless absolutely necessary, and attempts to persuade Gus to do much the same, he ends up becoming a part of and aiding greatly a criminal organization that deals in the suffering and death of other human beings for their own gain. In the process, he ends up getting close to a man by the name of Werner Ziegler, the chief engineer in charge of constructing Gus's super lab. But once the foolish Werner, who cannot bear the fact that he's been away from his wife for so long, decides to break the rules and leaves the compound he and his men are staying at, Mike is forced to confront an awful truth. After Werner is given the death sentence by Gus, Mike asks to carry out his sentence personally to prevent a man he had come to call friend from suffering greatly at the hands of his employers, which showed us, as well as Mike, that no matter how noble you are in this business, you're still going to have to bloody yourself, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that that blood may come from one of your friends. As heart-wrenching as this was for Mike, so heart-wrenching that it caused him to fall back into a bottle and get himself mortally injured in the process, after recovering in Gus's hidden village, Mike decides to play with the cards he's been dealt and continues down the road that by now he should have veered off of for good. I have people waiting for me. They don't know what I do. They never will. They're protected. But I do what I do so they can have a better life. And if I live, or if I die, it doesn't really make a difference to me, as long as they have what they need. So when it's my time to go, I will go knowing I did everything I could for them. Now you ask me how I keep going. That's how. This is something Mike says to Saul when they're out in the desert, and Saul wants to lay down and die. A statement that sums up Mike's continued willingness to labor for men like Gus Fring. But in continuing to do so, Mike ends up failing his family. Now we've talked about a few evil things Mike has done already, but I'm not going to run through everything Mike does in this series, because we'd end up discussing much the same things we already have by examining each of his crimes. It's enough to know that Mike kills plenty of men who are in the criminal game during his employment to Gus and then Walter. It's enough to know that Mike did everything he could to help Nacho and then did the same thing for Jesse, a man who was a father to anyone who needed it and not just his own kin. It's enough to know that Mike aided men like Gus and Walt and enabled them to commit atrocities that they may not have been able to were he not on their side. And it's enough to know that he often excused their behaviors or actions despite his strong moral foundations. But most importantly, it's enough to know that every single thing Mike did to provide for his family through engaging in criminal activity was all for nothing. Mike is a paradox, and he's a paradox because he consistently proves that he knows what's best and what's right, yet he chooses to ignore his instincts so he might provide his family with a better life. The greatest example of this is how he handles his relationship with Walt, a man who he describes as being a ticking time bomb, but a bomb that he subsequently places in his pocket and takes with him wherever he goes. And because Mike chose to entertain Walt after he murdered Gus, Mike not only lost all the money that he'd gathered for the sake of his granddaughter's future, but he lost what little life he had left to spend with her as well, as that bomb ended up going off and stole from him everything he had endeavored to accomplish and everything he might have been had he just listened to his own advice. Now, when examining Mike's character and determining just how evil he may be, I feel it's appropriate to compare him to the two men he worked for, Gustavo Fring and Walter White. Gus was a man who aspired to enrich himself alongside his partner and lover Max Arsenjega, a man who was then taken from him in one fell swoop, an event that caused him to dedicate his life to exacting revenge upon the men who had taken him from him, no matter the cost to himself or anyone else, be they innocent or otherwise. Walt was a man who, under the guise of providing for his family, endeavored to create for himself a position and empire that would rival or eclipse the position he felt he was denied by his friends Elliot and Gretchen, a wholly self-centered man who worked to achieve everything that he wanted at the expense of everyone else around him. Mike, on the other hand, was a man who became a criminal and committed acts of evil to provide for his family, even if that meant bringing great harm to himself or even his untimely death, which is without a doubt the most noble intentions you can have when deciding to pursue the path of a criminal. But it's not just their intentions and motivations that are worth comparing here, it's their souls. Gus and Walt both became ruthless and merciless men who would do nearly anything, if not anything, to achieve their goals. They would kill innocents, bomb nursing homes, and excuse the murder of children if it helped them inch closer to their goals. And in adopting this attitude, they lost much of their humanity. But even when Mike was engaged in much the same activities they were, he never lost an ounce of his humanity. As though Mike had been through a lot, nothing could have taken that away from him. His love for his son, his love for his fellow men like Werner, Nacho, and Jesse, his love for his granddaughter and his daughter-in-law, all kept intact despite all that he's witnessed and been tempted with. For not the starkest of horrors, nor the greatest piles of money, could ever make him forget his humanity. Even when he was surrounded by murderers, thieves, and gangsters of the highest order, Mike never lost who he was. He never blamed his problems on anyone else. He took accountability for who he was and the consequences associated with being who he was. Men like Walter and Gus were men who made mistakes and had things taken away from them, but they were men who subsequently lashed out at the world around them, no matter the cost to themselves, the ones they loved, or innocents who may have gotten in their way. Mike Ehrmantraut wasn't a man who harbored resentment for what he felt the world owed him. He wasn't a man who would lower himself to murdering anyone in sight in the pursuit of vengeful justice. He was a man who made many mistakes, yes, but he owned them. And he was a man who tried to earn money through criminal activity, but he was one who did it as honorably as he possibly could. And when his actions did result in innocent lives being ended unjustly, he felt a deep sense of guilt. But no matter your reasonings for committing crimes, and no matter how nobly you do so, they're always liable to catch up to you eventually. And the fact still stands that Mike committed acts of evil in service to his own interests, and those actions resulted in the deaths of at least 2 innocent people, his son, and the innocent bystander who helped the man that drove Hector's truck that he robbed. 2 innocent men whose deaths start and end with Mike Ehrmantraut. And in the end, they died for nothing. Not Mike, not Stacy, nor Kaylee benefited from anything he did in the end. There were precious few fruits reaped from Mike's illicit labors, and he left no lasting legacy of a family cared for or a world made better through his actions, save for perhaps the house he bought for Stacy and Kaylee, which is only the smallest of silver linings. Mike's life story is an enduring lesson. That lesson being that no matter what your intentions are when entering into a criminal lifestyle, chances are you're going to be a part of the 98% of people whose stories end badly, and not the 2% who get to ride off into the sunset with all their loot in tow. Mike was a good man, one who cared about the well-being of nearly everyone around him, even if it meant he had to make significant sacrifices to ensure they were cared for. But he was also a man who made all the wrong choices. He failed to educate his son in the ways of his business, and became partially responsible for his untimely demise. In his efforts to provide for his family and keep them safe, he caused the death of an innocent man. He allied himself with the devil, a man who went to the ends of the earth and was willing to destroy anything in his path to achieve his revenge. And when he perished, he allied himself to his successor, a man who would do much the same to assure he could make his life into what he always dreamed it would be. He was the best of them, but even the best aren't immune from suffering the consequences of their actions, or causing unintentional harm to those that don't deserve it. And though we can commend a man like Mike for his virtues, in the end, we must acknowledge that no matter how good he was, he did many terrible things that helped little and did great harm, showing us that even men with the greatest of intentions may still accomplish next to nothing in the end, and can unfortunately be crushed under the weight of every act of evil that they ever committed. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Mike? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially Elijah Kai VA, our Dark Lord channel member, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.